Welcome to this in-depth guide on auto layout in Figma. We're going to go over some theory, examples, as well as best use cases. You're going to learn about nested auto layout, about how to use auto layout in components, and how to prepare a component with component properties. I already did a video on auto layout previously, and if you're not familiar with the feature, if this is the first time you're hearing about auto layout, I strongly recommend you watch the video first. It should be on the screen right now, just to kind of start at the very basics. Watching that video will definitely get you up to speed with this feature. Right, so in my previous video I mentioned that auto layout is great for designing websites and user interfaces. And the reason that is because these interfaces and these websites are often generated automatically, meaning there are predefined, let's say, templates that are then filled with data that are loaded through a database or through different sources. Oftentimes, and there is a big similarity in the logic when it comes to actual interfaces and auto layout in Figma. Let me give you an example. Let's create a couple of placeholders for icons, right? So if you have, like, let's say 4 icons in an interface on a website, the way it works usually is that you have like a panel of some kind of icon panel, and then individual icons are being, or individual items in a container are being generated automatically. So if there are, for example, just 2 icons, this is what will be displayed. But then if the system needs to load, let's say 5 icons, this is what's going to happen. It's just going to stack one next to each other. And there are a few things the system needs to know when placing objects like this into an auto layout or into an interface. It needs to know the container needs to be defined, the width of the container needs to be defined, the size of the elements needs to be defined, and the spacing needs to be defined. And then perhaps something like alignment and positioning of the individual elements. So that's the reason why using auto layout makes the most sense for user interfaces and websites, because the underlying principle of object arrangement on an interface is very similar. So in my previous video, I already showed you that you can have like multiple directions of an auto layout. They can be stacked vertically, horizontally. The width of the auto layout can be set to fixed amount, or it can depend on the number and spacing of the elements within the auto layout, which is the case right now. If I change the spacing, the size of the auto layout of the container is changing with, is kind of respecting this spacing and padding that we define. I can also, change the width of the auto layout, in which case it's gonna switch to fixed, and it's not gonna respect the spacing anymore, right? So we basically told Figma that this auto layout container, this frame number 1, is 266 pixels wide by setting our own width, and from that it basically realized that, all right, so the user or the designer wants to maintain a specific width to this container, and that's in which case I'm gonna just switch that over to fixed. And if we again go back to hug contents, it's gonna return back. So a couple of things. So the key things to remember are that auto layout is a special kind of container, a special kind of layer group that is defined by, of course, the objects you are wrapping inside an auto layout, by the spacing of these elements, and then by paddings, horizontal and vertical, and of course alignment of these elements within, right? Then there's also these controls that we already played around with, either fixed or hug. Kind of defines the behavior of the auto layout, but in some cases even the elements within an auto layout. Let's just select one single element and learn how the positioning works within the auto layout. Right now we have a circle that's 25 pixels wide and tall. We have the auto layout container, and the way you can tell that this is auto layout is that it's written here basically. If this weren't an auto layout, you'd have like nothing in the auto layout part of the design panel. But we have an auto layout, and this auto layout right now, since it says hug, this means it's hugging the contents. It looks at this circle and says, all right, so this circle is 25 pixels, and there are paddings, horizontal and vertical both 10. So that means the whole auto layout is going to have 25 plus 10 plus 10 pixels width, and same with height, which means currently generated at 45 pixels wide and tall. If we change the size of the circle, the size of the auto layout is going to change with it. But we can also specify that the size of the auto layout is not going to be based on the size of the contents. And in that case, we can, changing the size of the contents does nothing to the overall dimensions of the auto layout. So that's also important to keep in mind. And in terms of positioning and alignment of the elements, right now there's this grid that you can click around and kind of specify where the elements, the auto layout elements, are going to be placed within the auto layout. Where are they going to be aligned to? So I think this is pretty straightforward. We have a circle that can be aligned to the left, right, top and bottom of the auto layout, but then also to the bottom left and bottom right, top left, etc. You get the point. A direction of elements and element spacing between items doesn't make any sense when there's just a single item, because you can't have a distance between an element and the element itself. Doesn't make any sense. You need two or more for that. Right. So I'm just gonna add a couple more of these elements, a couple more of these circles, just to better illustrate what's going on. So what's good to mention that you have the option to not just specify the horizontal and vertical paddings, but you can also specify each individual side. So let's say we didn't want this auto layout to have any paddings except for the top one. We could do that, right? We could just specify this. And then when we test this with alignment, you can see that you can align these circles all the way to the bottom right, but not all the way to the top right, because there is a top padding preventing these elements from moving to the very top edge of the auto layout. And if we change these to 10, you can see that now they can't move all the way to these edges as well. We can also define that, you can say that, okay, so these elements are gonna have 6 pixels or 19 pixels, 20 pixels, any amount you'd like of spacing. So that's one option. And the other option is to you perhaps want them to be spaced out across entire container, the entire auto layout container. You can do that. You can go to here and then just change the spacing mode to space between, right? And you also, here you can notice that this changes the look of this grid, where these elements suddenly cannot be aligned to the right or the left side. You can just choose bottom, center and top, which makes sense, because if you want these elements to fill up the whole auto layout, that's not compatible with aligning them to the right, because they are right now aligned to the left as well as to the right. They just are spread across the left-right axis, and therefore aligning to a single one of these doesn't really make any logical sense. Yeah, we can also change directions of these, in which case again you cannot now align to the top or bottom. You just get left, center and the right. And again, when you space them out across the container vertically, you then don't get to align them to either to the top or the bottom. Again, doesn't make any sense because they are already aligned to both sides. And this changes now to auto. So it takes the height of the whole auto layout and then it kind of calculates what's the spacing going to be. We can revert back to a fixed spacing value by defining this number again, for removing the auto statement. We also have, we get to choose which one is on top. Let me explain. We can also set negative spacing, right? So you can say that these are going to overlap by 15 pixels. So, and let's say one of them were, red, and we're going to name this ellipse red ellipse, and I'm just going to change the color of this one as well. It's going to be gray ellipse, right? Gray ellipse. And so at this point you maybe want to, this looks as if the red one is on top, whereas here it's on the bottom, which can be a bit confusing. You can switch the order around. You can go to here and then select canvas stacking first on top. Then the red ellipse is suddenly in the background. So it doesn't really make sense when the spacing is positive, but when the spacing is negative, you then kind of want to pay attention to this arrangement option. And then there's, of course, can ignore or include strokes. And I find it really cool that Figma included these animations. And I think it's really good. It serves well when understanding what's this feature about. So let me show you just, this animation explains it quite well, and these strokes also, right? So if you have objects that have strokes, it's gonna be outside. Right now the auto layout is ignoring the stroke, but now it isn't, right? So this size definition of width and height is 61 pixels for all of these, but that's excluding strokes. And auto layout is kind of including this 4-pixel stroke in the calculations when it comes to aligning these inside an auto layout. And so that's controlled by this option right here. I'm going to turn this stroke off. Let's build a basic feature card. Let's actually start going through some examples. So let's say this one, we create a headline, then we create also this is a sample text, lorem ipsum, just to have something here. I'm going to change the size to 10. Right, I'm going to select both these two, Shift A, and then decrease the spacing to 6, let's say, feature card. And we're going to add background and then padding. So we have a feature card. We have a card that has a headline, it has a text, and let's say we want this to, if we change the size of this card, we also want these objects to kind of respect the width, and we want this to be a bit responsive. We can do that by selecting these and then setting the width to fill container, and same here, again width, fill container. And right now what's gonna happen is auto layout is gonna change in height, as well as the contents are gonna change in height when the whole auto layout changes. And also what's important to note is that the whole auto layout needs to have the height settings set to hug contents, because if we don't do that, then this happens, which makes sense, right? If we set a fixed height to this auto layout and at the same time we want contents to adjust to the overall width of the auto layout, then of course it's gonna overflow, because it's gonna change. These objects are gonna change height. If we want the auto layout to respect that, to contain all of this, we just set this to hug contents. We can also click on each of these areas and change this. We can also change the spacing right here. That's pretty handy. And the moment this gets a little bit complicated is when you have nested auto layouts. So these auto layouts can of course contain another auto layout, and that's when you really need to start paying attention, because getting the final result right the way you want it can be a bit challenging. But once you remember the basics, it's going to be very easy. So let's just say that we'd have a couple of icons, couple of, I don't know, like buttons or something, and these would be arranged in an auto layout. This auto layout would have like a gray background or something, would have tiny paddings, and it would be rounded like this. So when the number of icons changes, this responds. We're gonna cut this, Command X, and paste it inside this auto layout. And then we're gonna, take another piece of text, move this downwards, and then select both of these, and then we wrap this inside an auto layout. So this feature card is gonna have a headline, a sample text, nested auto layout within itself, and this nested auto layout is going to contain a text and then another auto layout. So this is going to be a nested auto layout. And let's see what happens now if we change these. So you would say, all right, so now if I want this auto layout to respond to the width of the overall container, I need to set the width to fill container. And you would be correct. But let's see what happens. It still doesn't work the way you intended to. Why is that? That's because the text inside the auto layout is not set to fill container. And as soon as we do that, this is gonna change. So the text inside the auto layout now changes width as well, because the width of this element now depends on the width of this element, which now depends on the width of this element. So you have this sort of cascading width value. That's just gonna, go down the hierarchy of layers, and it's gonna be applied to whichever layer has the fill container settings on. And so this can be a bit frustrating because it's you need to be aware of the overall structure of this, and when there is like one extra auto layout, you can suddenly get lost very quickly. So it's always good to check the structure and then make decisions and adjustments based on that. But we also could set this icon container to fill the container as well, and that would, also this can now change. I'm actually not aware of a way where we could set this up in such a way that these circles would then stack beneath each other. If there is such a way, please let me know, because that would make things a lot easier. But as far as I'm aware, you are not able to define this within Figma. So that's definitely a limitation of auto layout, but there are always workarounds to do, so you're gonna figure something out. And again, we can position these icons, or quote-unquote icons, in any way, in any direction actually. And so yeah, this is a good question. What if we wanted these icons to be displayed vertically like this? What's the problem here? Why is this, overflowing into these objects? That's because the nested auto layout has the height settings and the vertical resizing setting set to fixed, and we want hug contents. So right now it's basically basing its height based on the height of the contents. And again, we could set the width settings to hug as well, and this is right now, it now works as intended. And so the really cool thing about building objects this way, kind of nesting auto layouts, is that if I want to add another text field, I can just duplicate this, or if I want to add another icon, I can just, do this without adjusting the overall height of this. It's automatic, it works great, it's really fast, and this is really good when you are like, imagine this, your client would reach out to you and say, okay, so we want this text twice as long. So previously you would have to change the size of this text field and then change the size of, maybe if it's nested within an auto layout like this one right here, you'd have to change the height of the auto layout and then the overall container, and it would just get really messy really quickly, and it's just not the way to go with complex layouts. So ideally the goal for you is, when designing user interfaces, you ideally want to use the auto layout as much as you can, because it then makes it really easy for you to adjust the design in any way and to be really flexible with the whole workflow. So right now, if I want to make this wider, you can see that this is just really easy to adjust, and we can remove this, right? So that's really cool about auto layout. And right now in this example, you can see why it's so good for designing user interfaces, and that's because of this flexibility and speed and power it gives you over the whole layout and over the whole process. Let's see another example in practice how you can utilize auto layout and nested auto layouts. That would be components. Let me just quickly prepare a alert window of sorts. So it would have, let's pretend again, please, that this is an icon. Let's use a headline, and let's use also like text field. And then let's use this again, button. So let's make this look as an actual button. Button's gonna be green. We have a button, we have a text field, we have a headline with an icon. So we're gonna wrap the headline and the icon into an auto layout. We're gonna name this headline and icon. Spacing is gonna be set to 4. Gonna be hug contents, gonna be fill container, and then we're going to take all of these and create an auto layout again. Then we will set this to fill container, this one fill container as well, and this one will be fill container. The button is not going to have fill container. So right now, if we change the width of this is what happens. That's intentional, that's good. So this is going to be a window of sorts. We're going to also prepare background, various objects in the layout, just kind of placeholder for things. You can ignore these squares, it's just a background for our object. We're gonna group this and lock them just like you have something in here. Okay, so we're gonna increase the padding, and then we're gonna set a background for this. We're gonna make this rounded. So here's the result, what we've done so far. It's responsive, which is good. We're gonna go to effects and apply background blur 40, and it's gonna be partially visible, this white background, and it's also gonna have shadow, just to make it, you know, a bit visually interesting. So here's the result. I think that's good. Gives it a little glass feeling. We're going to turn this into a component, and we're going to create an instance of this component. By the way, if you want to learn more about components, I already did a video on components. It should be in the description below, and on the screen right now gives you a good outline of how components work and the underlying principle. And so we're gonna go ahead and define that this item is gonna have a Boolean property. Name is gonna be show icon. Then this whole auto layout, this nested auto layout, is gonna have also a Boolean property, and that's gonna say show headline, right? So we have show icon, we have show headline, and then we will have also show button. And here we have an instance of this component. Right here you'll understand how powerful nested auto layouts and just auto layouts in general in combination with component properties actually are. And also, if you want to learn more about component properties, what I just did here, what's the logic behind this, again, you can watch one of my videos. I already did a tutorial on this, so definitely go check that out. Right, and so we have these controls right here, and we can choose that we want to hide this icon. And now we can, you know, also hide the headline and the button. So we have this sort of very flexible element, literally flexible, that we can, you know, call this like alert window, and we can just have multiple instances of this and choose how wide this is going to be and what's going to be displayed. We can just have, you know, just text and a button. And the reason what this has to do with auto layout is that if we didn't have auto layout applied, this is what would happen, right? We need auto layout to maintain the logic based on which this whole layout generates. And if we didn't have auto layout, it would be basically impossible to create reusable element like this. So I think that's really powerful when designing user interfaces. And also, it also goes without saying that you can actually modify the text contents. And thanks to auto layout, this is gonna modify the size of the window. And I think that's just really powerful. This is very good for design systems, which are basically, you know, guidelines for design, kind of a set of rules, set of elements that you and other designers can use when working on projects, especially in big companies. Design systems are necessary in big design teams because you just need to unify the design across many apps, many websites, interfaces, and this is a really good way to do this. And auto layout in this case is your best friend. So in this tutorial we've covered the basics of auto layout, alignment, settings of the auto layout. We also created a simple feature card and understood what nested auto layouts are, what are the potential problems you might expect, and we also created a dynamic component with component properties. And I think these examples show very clearly why this is a very handy feature, why you should use auto layout, and why it makes your job easier when designing interfaces and websites. I would like to ask you to let me know in the comments if there is anything unclear. I will try and answer all your questions. And if there is anything you'd like me to cover or explain more in depth, also definitely let me know. So, if you found this tutorial useful, I would appreciate you leaving a like. If you're interested in Figma and tutorials on similar topics, definitely go and check out my channel where I do plenty of tutorials on Figma. Thank you for joining me for this in-depth tutorial on auto layout, and I will see you in the next one.